Hello, and welcome to the first part of a two-part training on service learning, impactful teaching and meaningful service. My name is Diane Podolsky, and I am your Director of the Office of Community Engagement, and we are delighted to welcome Kevin Kelly as our presenter for this two-part series. Kevin is a highly regarded presenter for his expertise in distance education, educational technology, and service learning. We invite you to fully engage in this presentation. Kevin has recorded instructional segments, and between these, there will be time for you to pause the presentation and complete a worksheet where you can immediately apply the concepts he has just described. While this presentation is focused on virtual service learning, the concepts are adaptable to our transition back to in-person instruction, and we invite you to receive the information with this in mind. Please also know that the Office of Community Engagement is available to help you with any questions you may have about service learning or community engaged research. For those of you who are familiar with our office, we delight in providing swag and other giveaways to our faculty. There will be an opportunity drawing for a newly published book from Kevin Kelly at the end of the second part of this series, so please stay tuned for the details. And now, Kevin Kelly.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to a workshop on virtual service learning. This workshop originally is adapted from a three-part series that we conducted in 2020 for the Cal State University Systems Center for Community Engagement. So we're excited to have you here and looking forward to doing some work with you. In this part of the workshop, we're just going to give you an overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to outline the session outcomes and topics. We're going to describe the activities that you'll be doing throughout this session and the end products that you'll produce. And then we'll operationally define service learning and reflection as we're going to be talking about that throughout the entire workshop. The workshop topics and outcomes include how do we work on our courses to make sure that they align with service learning activities. And that might include creating online strategies for experiential learning and creating connections between the course and the service learning projects. We'll also talk about the community experience itself. How do we provide service learning opportunities when we're working at a distance, when we're in remote or online learning situations? Service learning can look a little different. And it also means that our interaction with the community organizations themselves will be different. So how do we work with them virtually throughout the process? Last, we'll talk about reflection. It's a critical part of service learning in general. And for virtual service learning, we have to consider the prompts that we provide for students so they can think about their experience and also provide support as students start creating evidence of the work that they've completed. This workshop is broken into 8 parts. We're in part 1 now, the overview, where we describe a service learning project at the end. What do we want to do for this whole workshop? And then we'll work on each part throughout. In part 2, we'll identify experiential learning strategies that you can conduct online with your students. In part 3, we'll make sure that the activities in your course are aligned with your service learning project. And in part 4, we'll start talking about the community organizations themselves and identify which types of community organizations you might want to contact. In part 5, we'll talk about that interaction with the community organizations themselves. In part 6, we'll talk about reflection prompts and make sure that those prompts are designed to engage students. In part 7, we'll really concentrate on supporting students as they generate that evidence of having done this work, because they could use it in future instances like working with potential employers or graduate schools. And last, part 8, we're going to wrap it up. How do you finish up what you started? How do you find the resources right there at Cal State San Bernardino and finish it up so that your students are ready to go in the semester? The way this workshop is organized, I'm going to do for each of those 8 parts a little mini lecture, somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. And then I'll ask you to pause your video and complete an activity. There's a worksheet that goes along with this video and set of slides. And so you'll be using that and bouncing back and forth, listening to me, and then filling out the worksheet. So let's talk about service learning in general. The Cal State Center for Community Engagement that I referred to earlier defines service learning as something that promotes student learning through active participation in meaningful and planned service experiences in the community that are substantively related to the course content. Then through reflective activities, students enhance their understanding of course content, general knowledge, their sense of civic responsibility, self-awareness, and commitment to the community. Now, the Center for Community Engagement also has a taxonomy where they provide 6 different areas that define aspects of service learning. That the activities be reciprocal between the university and the community. They be relevant. They're academically relevant, but involve community involvement, meeting some needs. They're explicit, where the civic learning goals are clear. They're reflective. As we've described before, we're going to have students engage in reflections to further their learning. They're integrated, where the assessment that you conduct is part of the process, not an add-on at the end. And last, that it's impactful. We want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the community through the course activities that we construct. So let's talk about types of service learning. There are about 4 types that the different literature shows. And again, looking at the National Service Learning Clearinghouse, I'm going to pick on those 4. There's direct and indirect service learning, where direct service learning in a remote context means it could be socially distant, where you're in person but staying far apart for safety purposes, but it could also be remote as in virtual. Students are providing direct services to different clients in a community, and examples of this might include tutoring, mentoring, again, in person but safe. It might be serving food by putting together boxes that people can put in the trunks of cars or what have you, assisting different communities that need help, and much more. Indirect service learning might involve working with a community organization or on behalf of an issue or population, but not interacting directly with that group of clients. And so those examples might include performing some administrative tasks for an organization, or providing administrative assistance, creating a marketing plan, developing a fundraising program, removing invasive plants in a public space. All these things are indirect. They serve a goal, but they're not working with any particular population. The last 2 types of service learning in the National Service Learning Clearinghouse definitions are advocacy service learning and research-based service learning. The advocacy service learning involves students educating others or creating awareness about topics of public interest. That might involve conducting a public information campaign, doing a petition drive, helping officials to draft legislation, planning and facilitating public forums, or presenting research to authorities and policymakers. The research-based activities might involve students gathering and presenting information related to areas of community interest or need. And those examples could be maybe geography students are performing research to create area maps, conducting needs assessments for local organizations, gathering information and creating media for nonprofit or government agencies. And last, maybe creating a guide of community services and or translating it into different languages that the community serves. If you're wondering about where do I find ideas for service learning projects, well, I've put together a few links here, starting with some from the California State University system. Cal State Northridge has some virtual engagement ideas. The School for Ethical Education, Toby Johnson and Associates has an online service learning project list. Edmonds College has some virtual projects ideas, and Inside Higher Ed, the periodical, has an article called Reimagining Service Learning in the Digital Age. It came out in fall 2020 while we were in the throes of the COVID-19 situation. So they have some ideas there as well. All right, so you've listened to me talk. Now it's your turn. Press pause on this workshop video, set a timer for yourself like I have here for 5 minutes, and complete part 1 on the worksheet, where you'll describe a service learning project or activity that you want to incorporate in your course. Now, obviously, you can go back to those links that I shared and get ideas before you fill out the worksheet. But when you're ready, restart the workshop video and we'll begin part 2. Welcome back. Now that you've identified a potential virtual service learning project that you want to include in your course, the next step is to figure out how are we going to engage students in an experiential learning process when they're online. So let's take a look at some strategies to do that. First, it's important to think about our context. This year, while we're putting courses online, we have to remember last spring, courses went from in-person to emergency remote teaching and learning. The focus then was just on helping students complete their courses, and we were in a very reactive mode. We addressed equity issues only as they arose. This year, we're continuing to use online formats in the Cal State system, but the focus is now back on student success. And we're in a proactive mode where we want to prevent equity challenges whenever possible. In both cases, it's important to maintain those connections between the course topics and the service learning activities, which we'll cover in this workshop. But before we do, I've mentioned the word equity a couple times. I want to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. I've been working with a group called the Peralta Community College District, and they've come up with a fantastic operational definition where they use the term equity to mean freedom from bias, assumptions, or institutional barriers that negatively impact online learners' motivations, opportunities, or accomplishments. That means we need to be thinking about, do our students, as they engage in these virtual service learning opportunities, have access to a device, or are they just using their smartphone? Do they have access to the internet, or are they driving to a McDonald's or Starbucks parking lot and trying to get a good internet connection from their car? Do they have a quiet place to work, or are they sharing a room with a sibling or a roommate, or are they in a situation where it's difficult for them to find a quiet place, period? All these things can affect the professionalism that they want to project when they're working with a community organization, and that's just one aspect of equity that we want to think about. We also want to think about the biases that might be in how certain things are portrayed or conducted. We want to think about their connection and to the community itself and the sense of belonging in your course and in the discipline. We want to think about how meaningful can we make this project to students so that they really take to heart the concepts from our course that we are sharing, and so on. So when we think about equity, we wanted to set that tone, have us all on the same page, and let's move forward. So when we talk about experiential learning, the types of activities that we might conduct with our students include defining a need or problem. Again, this might be where a small groups in your class do some research and make some presentations about needs or problems that a community faces. It might also involve getting input from a community organization or the community itself. The experiential learning process also includes the completing tasks or engaging in a process. Small groups, again, might do some preparation activities to get ready for working with a community, setting some norms to make sure that they're representing San Bernardino well. You might have a whole class discussion about that as an ongoing way to support students as they go through this virtual service learning exercise. They're going to have questions as they come up, and they're going to need answers quickly. And last but not least, as they engage with the community organization and the community itself, that we have to construct these activities and places for them to happen. Next, students are going to be generating evidence of what they're doing, and so we want to provide avenues for small groups to do peer review feedback. We want to provide avenues for the community organization with which the students are working to provide feedback. And we also want to provide places for students to give presentations or do showcases to share the final products and results with the community itself. Last, as part of this process, you want to make sure that students are reflecting on their work. And again, you might have small groups doing communal reflections where each student writes their individual reflections, but can then give feedback to the others about what they've written. You can do a whole class discussion as a way to synthesize the entire service learning process. And again, you can pull in that community perspective as part of the reflection. as a way to make sure that the reflection includes the perspectives of the community that you're serving. So the types of activities that you might consider, some good questions to ask yourself, follow those common question words. Who should participate or have access? When we're talking about these experiential learning activities, typically individual activities are great ways for students to prepare, but you want them to get used to working in teams, and that way that when they're working with the community itself, they're ready to go. Which activities do you want to be exclusive to your course, and which activities do you want to provide access to the community or community organization? Those might require different spaces so that you can keep them separate. That way you can have questions about the community without having the community know that those questions are going on. What tasks will the students complete? Again, here we're going to think about how we're aligning with our course and aligning with the community needs. When? Are these activities happening in real time, either in person and socially distant in a safe way, or on something like Zoom, like we are now? Or would they be asynchronous, where students are doing some work and maybe using email or Slack or some other tool to get feedback from the community organization on an on-demand basis? How? Will students need specific technology? Again, thinking about those access issues. Will they need any tutorials to make sure they're ready to meet the needs of the community without having to spend their time doing service learning, learning about how to do the service learning? And will they need any support? Sometimes the students may be quite ready, but they may need some help along the way. And so thinking about those aspects of the activities you construct, make sure they're built into the instructions, and make sure that you're ready to provide that. Last, why? How does the activity support reaching the learning outcomes in your course? And or how does it support working with the community itself? So those are different considerations. And here's an example. A problem-solving assignment might have certain steps, and some of these that we've already talked about. Identifying a problem or need, considering multiple possible solutions, proposing or selecting solutions related to certain contexts, certain cultures, certain ethics, evaluating that solution in relation to the history of the problem. What have other people done in the past? What's possible? What's feasible right now as we're in the space after 2020? And what impacts might the solution have? Then, is it possible to implement that solution? And then how can we review the results and evaluate the outcomes? So that could be one type of assignment that you ask your students to conduct throughout the course. It could be done with a community partner, or it could be done with the community itself. Some strategies to consider as you integrate an assignment like this into your class involve spreading the steps across multiple weeks to make sure students have time to complete each part. Organizing and designing each step, maybe through a discussion board or a Google Doc, so that students can work out the kinks before they actually implement the work. And then using Zoom with the community partner at the beginning and end of the process to make sure that they're involved and included. Now it's your turn. You've heard me talk about creating experiential learning activities for your students. So go ahead and pause the video, set a timer, this time maybe for 10 minutes. And then on that worksheet, identify at least one online activity that you plan to use with your service learning students. And then when you're ready, come on back and restart the workshop video. Welcome back. Now that you've completed identifying one or more experiential learning activities that you want to put into your service learning course, now it's time to make sure that there are strong connections between the course outcomes, what you want students to be able to do or know, and the activities that you have them complete for the service learning project. One way to approach this is to ask what knowledge, skills, and values can I make explicit in my service learning or community engagement course? Here are 5 ideas based on the Association of American Colleges and Universities value rubric on civic engagement. One is to connect disciplinary knowledge to one's participation in civic life. Sometimes we have a specific way of viewing the world, whether it be a scientific lens, a historical lens, anthropological lens, sociological lens, psychological lens. However your class is constructed, there's a disciplinary way of thinking that you might ask students to use to help solve these problems. 2, you might explain experience in civic activities in terms of a clearer sense of civic identity. So asking students to think about themselves in the context of the community they serve and where they live, and making sure that they understand they may have a commitment to public action for the common good. 3, adapting communication skills to collaborations, listening, acknowledging others' point of view, and guess what? These are skills that students can take into the workforce. So these are valuable. In addition to the service learning context, they're also going to help our students become more professional in the world. 4, working effectively in team and group contexts. It's not a bad idea to consider whether or not students on teams should have a role and what that role is in the context of others. Those roles could be general. You have a facilitator, a recorder, a timekeeper, a devil's advocate. There's a lot of research on team-based learning with maybe 5 to 7 different roles that students often play. A researcher. It could also be a role with respect to the community need. Let's say you're trying to help a community identify if they should stop serving soda in high school cafeterias. So the roles might include public officials, school officials, parents, students. By adopting those roles, we make sure that no perspectives are left out of the conversation. Last, ability to work collaboratively in community contexts. Some students may not have as much experience with certain communities, and so how do we work with them in a respectful way, making sure we understand that everyone's lived experiences are different. Doesn't make them better or worse, it just makes them different. And how do we respect those differences while trying to help that community meet a need? It's also important to infuse a dose of reality. This reality ensures that the clear connections between the learning outcomes and the service learning project, as well as making sure that we make appropriate time commitments, make clear goals, we understand what impacts we're intending to make, what the participants' commitment and buy-in is. Are we just doing this on our own, or does the community want our help? And are we designing this properly in a project management sense? There are 6 different aspects of this reality-based thinking where we want to make sure the projects are not time consuming for any of the participants, the students or the community. How do we define success so that it can be clearly measured? What are the roles, responsibilities, and commitments to make sure we complete the project? How do we identify the processes for clear and constant communication? How do we formalize project management protocols in order to make sure those expectation roles and responsibilities are clear to everybody involved? And last but not least, are we providing examples of anything like contracts, things that students will see in the future, but can use for experiences like this in the service learning context? Here's an example from my own course. I've taught a graduate level course on needs assessment. And so I wanted students to learn the needs assessment process, but they do it while creating a needs assessment for a real world organization. We've served police departments, trying to create training for the public, fire departments, let's say fireworks safety in July, different universities, different nonprofit organizations, and so on. We've helped a large number of groups, and we go through my course outcomes. Students understand the different aspects of writing a needs assessment, but the service learning activities tie directly to each outcome. So here you can see that they need to write a plan of what that needs assessment is going to entail. So first the teams interview the organization and write up a plan based on that interview. Then they learn how to analyze the data that's already been collected before we started. The teams learn how to analyze the data they can gather from the organization. Similarly, what data still needs to be collected? We need to develop instruments to do that. So then the teams develop their own instruments and go ahead and collect the data with that instrument through the organization. Then we talk about how to analyze that data. And so they do that and write a report. Finally, they need to know how to present their findings. And so they do. They give a presentation to the organization. It's very official, and you can do all this virtually. So this is one example of how I tied service learning activities to the course outcomes in my class. Here you go. We've ended part 3, listening to me. Now it's time for you to hop onto that worksheet and do some thinking. So pause the video, set your timer for about 5 minutes, and complete part 3 on the worksheet, where you're going to map course activities to your service learning project. When you're ready, come on back and restart the video, and we'll jump into part 4. Welcome back. In part 3, you came up with how do we make sure that the connections between our course and the service learning projects are strong and aligned. So now we're going to move forward to the next part of the puzzle, the community organizations. How do we find service learning opportunities that can happen at a distance? And how do we make sure that it's something our students can do safely? So a few ideas about adapting service learning online. It could be something related to outreach, where we use social media, emails, or live meetings to explore different avenues, create initial contacts or follow-ups and support, making sure that we're targeting service needs and addressing current issues. Right now, we have high unemployment. Certain groups, demographics are lacking technology or internet access and so on. And as we also want to make sure that we're targeting our course learning outcomes. Allowing for customized ideas and flexibilities for the due dates and the project flow means that we're not strictly tying these service learning projects to the calendar of the semester. We know that we want to try to finish these things in the time allotted, but having that flexibility means that we can adapt to maybe the community organization needs another week. Maybe the community organization is going to be closed for a short while. And so we need to have that flexibility to adjust. Incorporating one-on-one and small group meetings with the students into your timeline for your course and starting with simple focused project ideas that are feasible is a fantastic way to go. When you've done this for a number of terms, then you might consider something that might be a longer semester-long process. Another thing to consider is that idea from the Cal State Center for Community Engagement, reciprocity. It's one of their taxonomy concepts that you saw in that earlier slide in part 1. Reciprocity empowers all the participants to assist in the creating and putting the project together and also implementing it. Finding the appropriate groups that can work with distant students regardless of their geographic location. Not only are those community organizations going to be in different places, but so are your students. Some of your students may be in the San Bernardino area, but some may be in other time zones or even other countries. It's nice to work with relationships that the campus has already developed. And the Office of Community Engagement at Cal State San Bernardino has a list of organizations that might be looking for support. Crowdsourcing ideas from colleagues and students is another way to go. Basically brainstorming who needs help and what are the needs that we can support, making sure again that it's aligned with the outcomes of your course. It's important to make sure that with this concept of reciprocity that you're building in feedback loops and constant communication and making sure that the students have input in the process because they will be more motivated to participate. So I mentioned before that there are local service learning opportunities and your own organization, Cal State San Bernardino, has put together a list. The link here, tiny.cc/csusb-service-ops is one place to go. Again, if you're giving students a little bit of choice and you want to support students who are living outside the region, then I've put 3 different sources of service learning opportunities that are virtual here on this slide. The U.S. Department of Education has a service learning and volunteer opportunity page. A group called Points of Light has virtual volunteering opportunities, and a group called Volunteer Match is a service that you can use to help put individual students with a group that needs help. All right, that section was a little shorter, but it doesn't mean you have less work to do. Time to pause the video, set your timer for about 5 minutes, and possibly go back to those links that I shared and identify what service learning organizations or maybe categories of organizations would benefit from your project or align with the outcomes of your course. When you're done with that mental exercise, putting it down on the worksheet, So come back and restart the workshop video and we'll jump to part 5.